All right, thank you, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Brian. I am an MPA 1 student with the Kennedy School. I'm a research assistant with the Reimagine the Economy project. And it's my pleasure to introduce the panelists and the moderator for today for the industrial policy for the green transition session. So starting with from my left, starting from my right, actually. Let me begin by introducing Elizabeth Turbin. Sorry, my notes are place. So Elizabeth is currently professor in international political economy with the University of New South Wales in Sydney. Her current work and research is on the state and the strategic role in national techno-industrial development, adaptation, and transformation. So she has looked extensively into the East Asian experience, even up to today, as they engage in sophisticated statecraft in the green transition. She's also written extensively on the Australian renewable industry package, which is the Australian version of the IRA. Moving on to Alisher Terzi. He is currently an economist with the European Commission. He's also a professor with Sciences Po, HEC Paris, as well as Cambridge University. His work and research is on sustainable economic growth, especially in the European Union. He has written a lot about the topic, especially on green industrial policy, what he calls the necessary evil for to avoid a climate catastrophe. And he'll be able to motivate a discussion on why we need a green industrial policy. Next is Charles Sable, who is the Maurice Moore Professor of Law at the Columbia Law School. His current work is on the new models of economic development, emerging with the advanced techniques of industrial production. And his work is also on experimentalist solutions to the global problems. He'll be able to comment on the good jobs economy, which is very relevant to the just transition. He'll also be able to comment on the new policy approaches that we need for the green transition. Last, we have Abhishek Jayan, who is currently director at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, organization which he has been with for 10 years at this point. His work is on decentralized renewable energy, which he has written a lot about, and he'll be able to comment on this interesting topic, especially on industrial policy, especially as it pertains to remote and disadvantaged communities. Last but not least, it is also my pleasure to introduce the moderator, Ricardo Hausman, who leads the Growth Lab as a professor here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And under his watch, the Growth Lab has become a significant organization in the world today. His work includes economic complexity as well as growth diagnostics. So please put your hands together as we move on to the panel discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be here to participate in this super exciting event. I really was, my mind is still turning from the last session that I thought was really, really fantastic. Let me start by saying a couple of things just about the Growth Lab. In the Growth Lab, we're a group of about 50 people who do 4 things. We try to do basic research on growth. Basic, we mean that tries to appear in academic journals. We have a group of postdocs that work there and so on. We try to advance both on technology, on the green transition, on industrial policy, on other areas of knowledge diffusion. We like to work with governments at the national level, at states, at city level. At any point in time, we're about between 6 and 8 countries at the time. We like to transform our methods into tools that we put online. So things like the Atlas of Economic Complexity or Metroverse, these kinds of things, we like to make the tools available more broadly. And we like to organize executive education programs because while we teach in the master's program, there we form the leaders of tomorrow. In executive education, we talk to the leaders of today. So we're trying to create a community of practice around some of the things that we do. So that's who we are. What is industrial policy? Just to delineate some of the topics that we're going to talk in this session. When I think about that question, I might remind I remember Land Pritchett, who used to throw something at people whenever they mentioned the word institutions, because it's such an imprecise term. He says institutions is like furniture. You don't know if you're talking about a table, a chair, a sofa, etc. So I would say the same thing about industrial policy. It's like furniture. It's useful to know what it is that we're talking about. Is it the chair, the table, right? And there are many differences you want to make. Ernesto made the difference between trying to intervene in the market by changing relative prices, relative profitability to market players through kind of like Pigou type instruments and so on. Or are you in the business of providing public goods? And these public goods, what are they? What is the space of public goods? We tend to think, economists tend to think that the space of public goods is low dimensional. And the reality is that it's incredibly high dimensional, and you don't know its dimensions. You have to figure them out. So I was very impressed by Piero's examples yesterday about the things that were public goods that you would not have thought about unless you engage, right? There's issues of innovation. We saw them in the last session, right? And I liked Ernesto's connection of innovation being, in some sense, about market failures, but maybe not best thought of as market. It doesn't add too much. Once you've blessed them by saying, yes, there are market failures here, it still doesn't help you to know what exactly to do about them. There's learning by doing. We haven't talked enough about learning by doing. It was mentioned. You mentioned it in the previous session. There's industrial policy for the intensive margin, for the industries that exist, and the extensive margin. Now, for example, things like mesas ejecutivas and so on are great for the industries that exist, but not for the industries that don't exist. If they don't exist, who are you going to call, right? So these distinctions matter. Is it for existing technologies, mature technologies like solar panels? Is it for emerging technologies? Is it for mature markets, or is it for emerging markets, right? Is there a need for local adaptation, like, say, blueberries that need to be adapted, or is it plug and play? So how much, if innovation is involved in whatever industrial policy you're having to think about? Who are the agents involved? Are you talking about SOEs? Are we talking about big national conglomerates? Are we talking about multinational corporations? Are we talking about startups? These are very different kinds of beasts, right, that are going to require different ways of thinking about it. So I'm going to, if you allow me, redefine industrial policy from yesterday's definition to say that it is the process of identifying opportunities, discovering the obstacles or constraints that may make them hard to achieve, and evolving solutions so that you achieve those opportunities. So that's sort of like the general frame. So that's, I've just restated furniture, right? But I would like to ask myself the question, in this process, what's the role of economists? And I think that economics has found a comfortable place as the auditors of the system. Those are the ones that ex post measure, if they work, did it not work, what was the payoff, etc. And we train people to be very good auditors, and we teach them all the techniques for auditing. But a little bit what Mariano was saying yesterday and what Bruce was saying earlier, industrial policies need to be designed. And somebody has to think about design. What's the space of design? That looks more like architecture than auditing. And so, what are the tools that we can share for people to be able to design? So that's my 2 cents on industrial policy. You'll see that different people are going to take different slices of this industrial policy. But then there's the issue of green transition. And so let me say a couple of words to also map the space of green transitions, okay? Because the current frame says that the problem with the energy transition is that we're emitting too much CO2, that we share the atmosphere, so there's an obvious externality. So we face a coordination problem. How are we going to reduce our emissions? And this coordination problem we're going to solve through the Paris Accord, which is going to mean that everybody is going to focus on lowering their emissions. And if everybody focuses on lowering their emissions, the world will have reduced its emissions. So in that frame, you have kind of like 4 chapters. Chapter 1 is national mitigation. Every country focused on figuring out how they can lower their emissions. Adaptation, because climate is changing. What are you going to do about how that climate change is going to impact you? The third one is this just transition, because in the process of transitioning nationally, there will be losers. What are you going to do about them? And final chapter is sort of like green finance. And green finance is all about, you poor guys didn't put the CO2 up there. We did, but now we want you to forgo fossil fuels. So we're going to subsidize your foregoing fossil fuels by giving you a subsidy. Let me say that all of that is not industrial policy. In some sense, it doesn't belong too much in this conversation. But I think, let me just reframe the problem of the energy transition a little bit to say, first, we're emitting too much. That's a problem. We start on the same point. But to stop emitting, the world is going to need a lot of stuff. It needs to electrify everything that can be electrified. It'll need to make that electricity in clean ways. It will need to, there's a lot of stuff the world will need. And so countries should ask themselves not just what can they do to lower their emissions. They should ask themselves what can they do to help lower global emissions by producing the things that a decarbonizing world will need, right? And that's we call that green growth, because it is green growth in the sense, it's not that you're going to constrain your growth so that you don't emit. It's that by supplying global needs of decarbonization, the more the world tries to decarbonize, the more you sell, because you're on the supply side of the story. So I think that's an important distinction within this space, whether we are talking about encouraging companies to lower their emissions, or we're about doing a little bit what was said about China, that they corner the EV market, et cetera, that they are trying to supply global needs of decarbonization. So to discuss these issues, we have a truly fantastic panel that has already been introduced, so thanks for saving me that job. I'm going to start with Chuck Sable. Chuck has been thinking a lot about industrial policy for many years and has been doing it empirically in his way, in his unique way. He's come up with a book last year, I think, or the year before, on industrial policy and the green transition with David Victor. But he's a co-author of both Danny and me, so let me ask Chuck, what is the difference of green industrial policy vis-a-vis standard industrial policy, and how do you think about industrial policy in the space of the energy transition?
I think about the green transition in the second sense that you introduced this. Not as a series of measures to price the externality and reduce. Stuck. Here, I'll just hold it. So I think about the green transition in the second sense, not as that you introduced, not as pricing externalities, but rather as an obligatory, a mandatory challenge to reinvent the entire economy in such a way that the emissions don't occur. And so that's an insane, there couldn't not be anything more hubristic than wanting to invent the economy. And you might think that a race, the human race, that it got itself into the trouble of ruining the climate would not embark on the hubris of then correcting this error by further hubris. But we're damned to do that. We are absolutely damned to do that. Hayek be damned. We can't go back to a world where we can pretend that by just not interfering, we'll produce a humanly acceptable outcome, because we, in this regard, did not interfere, and that's not the outcome we have. Moreover, I think of, in connection with work with Danny, I think of the green transition in conjunction with a second very similar problem, which is the problem of readapting the economy to the needs of the skills that we are actually going to produce and be able to use, not the industrial skills that we had in the previous cohorts of industrialization, but the set of skills that are going to be relevant. And we're going to do that. We again need to bend the trajectory of technological development and away from technologies that substitute skill to technologies that complement skill. So once again, enormous hubris, and I think the second transition is as mandatory as the first. I think we could get, it's hard to imagine how you'll get a successful green world if half the people are at the margin. So, because they won't be able to actuate the measures that necessary to keep pollution from rising. So in poverty, the pollution goes up. Now, I think that this, we know, that though the task is gargantuan, we've had a lot of experience, as many people have pointed out in these earlier discussions in the last very fruitful days. We have a lot of experience in dealing with this, though that experience is mixed in the sense that there are many different endeavors. So I want to focus on one strand of the experience of industrial policy. The strand, let's say, that culminates in that very interesting characterization we just heard of China having adopted an industrial policy at the end, and at which, just as the moment of great uncertainty about the manifold possibilities of technology becomes available, that's the strand I want to follow. And here's the logic undergirding it. If you want to do something impossible, you have to start with acknowledging first that the targets, though necessary, are infeasible under current circumstances, and you have to pick intermediate targets that advance the goal and educate you as to the possibilities for going further, whether to redirect, correct, and whatever. So you need a world in which people acknowledge uncertainty, perhaps infeasibility in some sense, but explore it by a series of interim measures. Those interim measures, in turn, have to be agreed with the government. We're all agreed about this. It's not that the government can do this. The uncertainty means immediately that an open-ended cohort of external collaborators, the private sector and other nations, the world in some sense, but certainly the private sector, have to be involved. And so we're in the situation where the government has to sign contracts with outsiders to do things that no one knows whether they can quite be done or not, in the hopes that, proving doable, they'll lead to another succession of contracts that get us yet closer. Now, that's the challenge of industrial policy. Much of the discussion here has taken note of that and said, well, we need to build up the capacity of the government to do that somehow. So Ernesto had a nice chart where there were a lot of gridlocked wheels, and you introduce a counter movement and suddenly all the wheels are unblocked. I wish it were like that. I wish you could unblock government by finding a magic wheel to insert. But some have suggested something close. The magic wheel that we prefer is called capacity building, meaning training the bureaucrats or training somebody, the recipient. So, and the first proposition I want to put before you, it doesn't seem contentious to me, is that won't work. In order to have a government that can do these novel things, writing contracts which are not contracts, I'll come back to that in a second, you need another type of government. You need a type of government in which the relation between the people signing the contracts and the people higher up is porous enough, transparent enough, mutually consulted enough so that there can be an ongoing discussion about what's the right level, intermediate level to aim for now, what's progress towards that level, how do we set the next goals? And that's not just a question of having well-educated people, it's a question of having a different form of government with different ways of interacting. Now, we got some indications of this. Professor An said yesterday that in China, what you have de facto is you have a consolidated state that follows the rules, and then you have an out-of-the-box state that invents and does stuff. And of course, the question is how those two things coexist in one state, those two things coexist in the head of one person. But the state we want to talk about is a state in which those two activities are no longer polar opposites, but somehow are integrated. So where discussing and challenging the rules is itself governed by rules, and the revisions are supple. They're not episodic the way they would be in a rule-bound state, but they themselves are challengeable in their turn. Okay. Now, and by the way, let me just say add one more thing in that domain. Ricardo's examples of the rice growers and so on, these are, I think the correct way to think about these things is insisted little alternative governments, somehow nested into the large structure of the national government. The new government, those insisted governments operate in this new way, and they've found a way to insulate themselves from the outside. Piero's mesas, executive mesas, they're the same. He created a form of government, a bubble, a kind of alternative government bubble inside the Peruvian government, and it lasts as long as he can wave his magic wand over it. But what we're talking about in the successful cases is it's not just mission orientation. It's not just a reconviction or a retooling. It's something very deep about the organization of government. Let me illustrate how this is actually happening. This is so the United States is spending trillions of dollars on these things. And there will be massive government procurement of these new goods. All of a sudden, there's an explosion in the use of a new type of acquisition instrument. Normally, there's a contract subject to the federal rules of acquisition. And as in Ricardo's auditor sense, the signal feature of the standard contracts is that they're highly, highly regulated, and therefore the end product has to be highly specified. Because how would you judge it if you didn't have an exact specification? The provider could say, oh, I thought that's what you meant, and so give me the money. So the need for accountability in the current system leads directly to a kind of hyper-specification, which is the exact opposite of what you need in a world which has to indulge in incremental steps on the way to rendering impossibility possible. Of course, people are clever, and starting in 1958, the United States government, for advanced military projects, made a tiny exception to the acquisition rules called with great poetic imagination, alternative transaction agreements. And these ATAs, as aficionados call them, remained a tiny sideshow. All of a sudden, they're exploding. And what ATAs do is they explicitly recognize the impossibility of ex-ante determination of the product, and they institute a regime in which conditionality, and here I want to use the word that Danny and Mariana invoked, conditionality takes on a very specific form. Conditionality is not a condition written down to be respected by the other party. Conditionality emerges in the continuing joint discussions of the party about the basis of the possibilities as they're revealed in the, okay? And the auditor should understand that in turn. Now, the point here is not, I'm not trying to say that if they only have these contracts, that will be the end of the story. The fact of the contract is the entry wedge of a much larger transformation, because the military, unlike us civilians, is enormously aware of the human requirements, the skill requirements for administering such contracts. And they know immediately that the people who've been administering the traditional ones can't do. So there has been induced a stepwise transformation in the nature of these agencies, which of course has analogs in what the FDA is doing in the development of the vaccines and so on and so forth. I don't mean that these are not isolated developments. They're most manifest there. Let me come back at the end. There's this second task. The second task is to think, okay, this green transition should be complemented by, it needs to be complemented by a similar transformation of technology for purposes of creating good jobs, or more generally creating good jobs or increasing welfare. Now, the way a lot of my progressive friends, and your progressive friends, I imagine, think about this is we'll add conditionality onto these requirements. So if you build a chip factory, that's great. If you're progressive and you build a childcare center, the chip factory, you get a bigger bonus. And it goes on until people are so enthusiastically progressive that we get a welfare state without having to actually do anything but encourage people to build, progressives to build chip factories. I think that's crazy. I think that's crazy and an insult to the magnitude of the task of building a decent welfare system. Where I do see a deep connection is that building a welfare system that can respond to the needs of different kinds of kids in school. So the vexed question of school reform, provide social services to families in radically different situations. And if the services are not customized in their sequence and content, they don't work, because it's the package that determines their effectiveness, not the incidents, the disaggregated instance of different programs. The firms that can respond to those demands have the same organizational features, contract in the same way. Their internal language of organization is the same as the firms that are engaging in the transform the nature of our green technology. So I want this is not a view that encompasses all of the valid purposes of industrial policy. I want to focus on this because I think for the future, we have, through the horrific consequences of our blunders, we've blundered into a situation where we're going to get a chance very quickly to learn about the possibilities of our ability to reshape our economy. I hope we learn them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I mean, there's so many ideas there, but I like a few of them. The idea that you're going to train a government sounds to me like we're going to provide them with executive education, it's one thing for a person to know something; it's a different thing for an organization to know something. And what you need is organizations that know how to do things, not individuals. And that's a very important comment. Alessio, I'm going to go to you. You have written a book on good green for growth, or green growth good, or something good, growth or good. And
you have to read it again, Riccardo. You don't remember the title.
There was green, there was growth, and it was good. So tell us, where is industrial policy for the green transition in the EU these days, and where should it be?
So thanks a lot. I still have a few notes. I remember I attended a course with Roberto Magavera Unger and Dani, and I remember Roberto starting his talk saying, I'm going to argue my point in 12 points. Point one has 4 sub-points without one note, without anything. And I was deeply impressed that you managed to do that. I'm still human only, so I still have notes. Yesterday, Rohit started his talk by saying that that in a way showing emotions is frowned upon in the Western culture. I don't know if Italy is a part of the Western culture, but being the country of drama, I was just gonna say, the last time I was here, I was a student, I was sitting in the audience. Riccardo, you were talking. So now being on the other side feels very humbling. In a way, my introduction, or the few things I was going to say are being spoiled. There was a spoiler in my introduction. I've been presented as the guy of industrial policy as the necessary evil, which is one of the titles of something I've written. So that is a bit the theme of what I'm gonna say in these brief remarks. I went to an English school. They taught me that you want to start with every essay or intervention with a quote. So the quote I picked for today is actually by Larry Summers. Maybe it was pronounced in this room, I don't know. And what he was saying about industrial policy is that he would like his industrial policy people to be like his generals. And the idea there is that you want people who can fight the good fight if it's needed, but ideally hate war. And so you want your industrial policy people in a way to hate industrial policy, but do it and know how to do it well. And the problem sometimes is that the people doing industrial policy are actually the ones that really love it at all costs. So that is a bit how I got to industrial policy itself. I am not necessarily the industrial policy aficionado. I care about decarbonization. I care about reaching net zero. And in that sense, industrial policy, to my mind, is something that can help us to achieve that. And that is how I got into this topic. That's why I've started writing about this topic. I'm going to make 3 points to spice things up. I was going to give a name to these 3 points, which we can. I'm a fan of Western movies, or spaghetti Western movies, as they're called, given they're made by Sergio Leone. So it's going to be the good, the bad, or the ugly, and the ugly. Or Mariana tells us that everything sounds better in Italian, so we can also call it il buono, il brutto, e il cattivo. We start with il buono, which is to so the good, which is to say that there is a strong economic rationale for industrial policy in the green dimension. Just as a small anecdote, I wrote a paper while at the European Commission. I managed to publish a paper which is an official paper of the European Commission, which talks about industrial policy and why we need to do it. And I sent it to Dani. This was a few years ago, and I said, oh, it's been hard to push this over the line, but finally it's there, it's out there. And I got a one-line reply being, well, I didn't think by now, I thought that everybody was on board with this thing. I'm surprised that that is still a fight. Well, it is. And to my mind, we are seeing a lot of this resurgence of industrial policy. This has been documented. It has been discussed already yesterday. It is my impression that we are seeing it very much, if not predominantly, because of the competitive argument and the geopolitics argument. This has already been raised yesterday. We are not seeing it so much because the economic rationale for it has won the hearts and minds of politicians, bureaucrats. But nonetheless, there are strong economic arguments that I think are worth making and worth underlying. These build on literature that some of the people in this room have contributed. There is the classic idea or example that you want to break technological lock-ins. And so it is not sufficient to just make sure that the green option is as cheap or as expensive as the brown or incumbent option, because even if that were the case, there are some technological lock-ins within our societies. Think about the infrastructure. So if an EV is just as expensive as an internal combustion engine car, and however, for you to refuel it or load it or charge it up, you have to wait miles and miles to find a place, and instead there is a gasoline station every 2 miles, then that's a problem. And so things like this mean that you wanna, this creates an argument in favor of industrial policy to support green technologies. This relates also to so-called directed technological innovation. And these papers by Acemoglu, I've discovered yesterday that I've mispronounced this name for all my life, and Guillaume, who have been looking indeed at the fact that if you let companies just do innovation, they will continue building on the innovation that they were doing before, because it is a marginal improvement process. And if you want to, let's say, reorient completely, as you were describing the economy in a different direction, in the early stages, it makes sense to use a strong lever that can be industrial policy. There is a second argument, a classic argument, is the combination of risk aversion with lack of perfect information. And this is the idea that firms will engage, or will have a tendency to engage in a wait and see type of behavior, just because they don't know exactly. And obviously there are some positive externalities if they were to invest in green innovation. This incidentally is the same reason why we do R&D, public R&D in general. And so the idea that there are some positive externalities that firms do not internalize entirely, and this is particularly true for the green transition. And it is particularly true for goods that are far from marketable. And so you want to do particularly industrial policy, or consider it for things that are far from market. Classic examples being cement, that we don't know exactly yet how to decarbonize, like aviation, that is going to take a good decade or more to fully decarbonize, and that is one of the arguments that has been made. And there's more, but the final point I'm going to make on this aspect is the political economy dimension. And it's something that John Reenen has been talking about, among others, which is to say maybe there is an optimal carbon price that you would want to reach, and that would allow you to do the green transition, but politically this is not going to happen. And because politically this is not going to happen, you want to use industrial policy to sort of reinforce or support the green transition. This takes us to my second point, of the bad. And the bad is that there are limits to what you can achieve with industrial policy on the green transition dimension. I'm saying this because my impression, maybe I guess I'm coming from the European perspective, where we still believe in carbon pricing. And I was giving a podcast last week to it's called the Energy Transition Show. I am told that for people who are into energy, this is the place to be. It's the late night, Saturday Night Live of energy geeks. And so I was talking to the host, Chris Nelder, last week, and he was telling me, yeah, you know, like carbon pricing is never going to happen in the US. I think it's a bad idea. So good thing that we're doing the IRA, good thing that we're using industrial policy as a tool to decarbonize. I mean, that's great that you're doing the IRA. That's great that you're using these tools, but there is no way you're going to reach net zero only with the Inflation Reduction Act or only with these type of tools. It is hard to calculate these things. Some people have tried to do it, but the IRA, more or less ballpark, is equivalent in terms of what it will achieve in terms of decarbonization, something like $30 per ton in terms of $35 per ton in terms of carbon pricing. This is far away from the optimal carbon pricing you would need to reach net zero, which means you would need a new Inflation Reduction Act every 5 years, all the way until you reach net zero. This ain't gonna happen politically, but also because you will run out of fiscal, even the US at some point will run out of this fiscal space to do the green transition only through this type of tools. So you still need carbon pricing to reinforce the logic. And the final dimension, which is the evil, or il cattivo, is that industrial policy, to my mind, will lead to further trade fragmentation, or the use of it, and greater deglobalization. Now, you can separate your furniture of industrial policy, to mention what you were talking about, in two categories at least. So one is the offensive side. This is what the literature calls it. I'm not making these terms up. The offensive side and the defensive side. The offensive side of industrial policy is typically things we like. If I want to simplify, it is things like tax credits. It is things like R&D spending. It is things like supporting infrastructure. All of that is in the offensive side of industrial policy. The defensive side of industrial policy is it's something that economists normally dislike more. And they would say, you don't want to use local content provisions. You don't want to use, or only to a limited extent, FDI controls, and so on. And in a way, it has been framed as if, these are some negative sides that came with, for example, the Inflation Reduction Act. It's too bad. It should have been different. To my mind, the offensive side lays the seed for the defensive side. And so if you're using subsidies to an extent of 300+ billion and you're putting that amount of money on the table, to a certain extent, the political economy will push you to implement the defensive side that we like less. If you are all about bringing technologies or nurturing technologies of some sort within your countries, you will not allow foreign companies to come in and buy that technology. And so you will be raising trade barriers. And that ain't good because obviously you're limiting the amount of tech transfer at a time when we know that decarbonization will require this tech transfer across the world. To a certain extent, I remain one of the generals that dislikes but still would do, and I go around, let's say, talking about the need for green industrial policy because I link it to other parts of the literature which says, look, this deglobalization was going to happen in any case. And so what green industrial policy is doing is that it's reinforcing a trend that would have happened in any case. And so we have to be aware of it. We want to try to limit its negative impact, but it was going to happen in any case. And that is why I remain convinced of its usefulness. Thank you.
Very good. Let's move on to Elizabeth Urban. So Elizabeth, you've been thinking a lot about East Asia and the transition in the context of East Asia. You see them from below, I mean, coming from Australia, I guess? Or...
Yes.
So,
Depends
so
on
you can see under the hood, I guess.
Yes, this is true. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, excellent. Thank you for the kind introduction. And thank you to Danny too and the team for having me here. It's such a pleasure and a privilege. And I've learned an enormous amount so far. So I'm very happy to be talking today about what we might learn collectively from East Asia's approach to greening and the very strategic role of the state in that process. And so the comments that I'll make are going to draw on my recent book, the title of which is important because it speaks to the arguments I'll make today. It's called Developmental Environmentalism, State Ambition, important, and Creative Destruction, equally important, in East Asia's green energy transition. And that's co-authored with my lovely Australian colleagues. And I will say, don't buy it because it's free from Oxford University Press for download, thanks to the Australian taxpayer. We've already paid for it so that you don't have to. So I think you'd all be very familiar with the fact, and we've heard today, that the countries of Northeast Asia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, more recently China, are kind of the poster children of strategic industrial policy. and that they hold really important lessons for developing countries. That may seem contentious in some quarters, but I think it's widely appreciated in others. But for years now, the conventional wisdom has been, and I think we heard a little hint of this earlier, that with the exception of China, East Asia's developmental states, as they've matured, their governments have kind of become less involved in strategically guiding their economies, that developmental states have kind of dismantled or died, kind of horrific death, or else normalized or converged on a kind of Western hands-off approach to strategic techno-industrial governance. And I think it's also really widely believed in the West, especially, that while Northeast Asian governments, especially China and especially South Korea, talk a really big game on greening, on green growth, that this is really just greenwashing, and that really what's going on in Northeast Asia is fossil fueled business as usual. It's something we hear really widely. It's a very popular perception. And thanks in no small part to the kind of fossil fueled incumbents that, why would they change? So in our book, we take really serious issue with those claims. And we make a number of counter arguments, and at the great risk of oversimplifying, I want to just try and, I guess, distill what we're saying in 5 key points, just 5. And I really hope that might open up the door for some productive lines of conversation in the discussion that follows. So the first point really is that contrary to the conventional wisdom, strategic techno-industrial governance remains alive and well in East Asia, and not just in autocratic China. In fact, in South Korea, in Taiwan, and in Japan, developmentalism is alive and well. And more than that, it's having very positive, at least in some respects, transformative implications. So developmentalism doesn't die with democratization. Is the first point that I would make. The second point that we would make is that these states' traditional developmental ambitions and related strategic techno-industrial policy initiatives, long trained on building the kind of fossil-fueled industries of the past, and we heard about shipbuilding yesterday, and steel making and automobiles, are now being turned towards promoting a rapid green energy transition. And in fact, the governments of China and South Korea, and they're the 2 cases that we focus on in the book, and we focus on them because they're very different regime types. One is an autocratic regime and one is an advanced democracy. They are now leading global efforts centered on building the new green energy industries of the future. And they've been doing that not just for a short amount of time, but for the last 15 years or more. And even more significantly, since 2015, they've turned their strategic ambitions to fossil fuel phase out. So they're involved both in the kind of creative side of the green energy transition and also in the destructive side. And most ambitiously starting with coal phase out. So in other words, what we're seeing in East Asia's greening initiatives is far from greenwashing. There is something really fundamentally transformative underway in the region, and it's exciting. And it's the transformation of East Asia's developmental states into what we call developmental environmentalist states. And I'll say more about developmental environmentalism momentarily. The third point that we would make is that East Asia's approach to greening differs fundamentally from the approach that we see in the West. In the West, and we've heard some of this as well, this challenge of the green energy transition is framed overwhelmingly as a moral issue, as an existential question, the need to respond to dangerous climate change. And in this context, the overwhelming debate has centered on the need to reduce fossil fuel use, absolutely, and to achieve this by placing a price on carbon, and do that through international cooperation. And so as a consequence, the policy debate has tended to focus on the economic costs of the transition and who can and who should bear those costs. In East Asia, it's just the other way around. It's completely different. The debate has been framed completely, yes, in the opposite way. So in these states, until recently, the issue of climate change really didn't rate a mention, certainly in domestic political debates. Greening efforts have been framed overwhelmingly as the necessary response to pressing national economic concerns and to energy security challenges, and therefore positioned as a massive economic opportunity. Specifically, the chance to seize global leadership in the green energy industries of the future and to secure the new high-wage, knowledge-intensive jobs of the future. So I would point out that this isn't to suggest that environmental concerns have not been front and center of debate also, but the environmental concerns that are compelling East Asian governments to move in this particular direction center largely on particulate pollution, which of course poses a massive political legitimacy challenge for these governments, because in Seoul, in Beijing, in many industrial centers of these countries, on many days, if you go outside, you can't breathe. It's a huge political legitimacy concern. So in East Asia, the policy emphasis has been very different from the West, first on new green energy industry creation, and then phasing out fossil fuels. I think that I would point out that this has in many ways allowed these countries to build a political consensus around greening goals and to take advantage of the cost reductions, of that learning curve that was mentioned earlier that is so central to manufacturing industries. And of course, greening industries are manufacturing industries. And so this is particularly important in terms of, yes, building that consensus without focusing on climate change. And I think we've seen in the West that the focus on climate change has ended up being quite politically divisive. That's not to say it's not a very serious moral issue and not a reason not to act. It is. But East Asia presents a very different approach. Water? The fourth argument that we make is that while these states have been really led the greening process, they've initiated it and they've led it and they've consistently promoted it through strategic interventions in the market, this is not industrial policy. And this might be somewhat controversial. I think that the strategic interventionism that we're observing in South Korea and China is of a much higher order. And rather than industry policy, we argue that what we're seeing in East Asia's greening initiatives is a kind of economic statecraft. And in particular, it's a domestically oriented economic statecraft. And for this idea, I draw on the work that I've done collaboratively with Linda Weiss on South Korea and the US and China. And domestically oriented economic statecraft is best defined as bold government initiatives intended to create and to grow and to dominate markets and industries at the techno-industrial frontier in order to fend off and outflank and move in step with rival powers, and very clearly defined rival powers, whether those rival powers are economic or political, geostrategic, or all of the above. So specifically, Korea's greening strategies have been developed in almost a direct response to the looming threat of China's technological challenge and takeover. And China's greening strategies have been designed and developed with the almost explicit purpose of catching up with and surpassing the US as the world's techno-industrial hegemon. And it's this geostrategic element, this national security, economic security, and political military security driver that lends East Asia's greening efforts its very ambitious and highly targeted and very disciplined nature. But that said, the success of these strategies doesn't hinge on any kind of top-down command and control type of relationship with the business sector. Far from it, actually. What we see is very close, collaborative, long-term, highly strategic government-business relationships centered on shared goals and with very clearly monitored targets and outcomes. And I guess our fifth and final point is that in strategically intervening in markets to promote the green transition, East Asian governments aren't trying to displace the market. Rather, they're adapting what Johnson very helpfully described back in the 1980s as market-conforming modes of intervention. Of course, we heard Professor Norton argue earlier that China is going somewhat beyond market-conforming modes of intervention now, but by and large, and certainly in South Korea, we would describe these as market-conforming modes of intervention. Why? Because they're aimed just to speed up the Schumpeterian process of creative destruction that sits at the heart of all major techno-economic shifts, not least the green energy shift. And so here we see state ambition and creative destruction working hand in hand. And what the government is trying to do is to first start with the creative aspects, drive that creative new industry creation, and then to take advantage at a particular moment of cost reductions, at which point they are now, and since 2015, have been seeking to phase out fossil fuels. Not mission accomplished, but it's certainly a different approach. And I think it's certainly worthy of our analysis. And I might say a little bit more in the question time about what I mean by developmental environmentalism.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let me move now on to Abhishek Jain. Abhishek, you have been, in some sense, deploying a technology that has green origins, but to solve a problem that is different from the environment. It was simply access to energy in remote areas, right? So, I would like to invite you to comment on the subject.
Thanks, Ricardo. Can I get the clicker, please, and have the presentation on? Great. Am I audible or? Yeah, great. Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you for having me here. I think in some ways, I'm the odd one out. I'm not an auditor, but rather wearing a hat of close to an architect, or rather I would call being an orchestrator in some ways. What I'm going to talk today is really what does the green paradigm for India mean, and how is it different from some of the Western ways to look at it, and so on. I hope the font is not too small. So yesterday, Rohit alluded to this, but India needs to create 1 million jobs a month. That's the rate at which we add working age population to our overall demographics, right? Now that's the scale of challenge we're looking at. So by 2030, we need to create 90 million jobs in the non-farm sector. Now, since you're creating these jobs now, and this youth is going to be employed for the next 30 to 40 years, you need to make sure that these are jobs which are going to be relevant in the next 30 to 40 years. So you actually want to create those jobs in future-ready, future-proof areas rather than areas of the past. And in that sense, green sectors do pose an opportunity because these are going to be the relevant sector as we move towards net zero collectively. Right? So, but story around green is usually equated to the story around energy transition. And we do not even consciously think about, and we interchangeably use these terms, that, okay, green transition is a green energy transition. Whereas that is just about changing the fuel that we are using, and it's a kind of a tail end solution without questioning the economic structures, the other economic activities for which that energy is being used, and can we do things differently. It becomes particularly important for countries like India, where a lot of the infrastructure still needs to be developed. So can we develop in a different way? Instead of the lock-ins that are created already in the developed economies, we do have a chance to create different pathways rather than getting locked in and only think about energy switch. And it becomes particularly important from a jobs story, because energy transition alone in India will nowhere create the kind of jobs that we need to sustain the large demography. And in this job story, like just expanding this problem set and then the solutions beyond energy transition to start looking at many other green sectors. Materials replacement. So far, the story around material replacement is let's have green steel and green cement. But that is actually an energy replacement story. just coal to, or natural gas to green hydrogen? Can we look at materials which are different altogether? Can we look at bamboo as a replacement to steel? Can we look at rammed earth as a replacement to cement, and so on? And these are, just by the very nature, far more job-intensive sectors than highly automated green hydrogen or green steel plants. And then look at even beyond climate when it comes to green. Like green need not to be only limited to the climate as the only problem that we need to solve, right? There are water-related challenges, there are biodiversity-related challenges, there are soil health-related challenges, and so on. So as you expand that ambit, you realize that the opportunity to create jobs and create economic opportunity is like much, much bigger. Now, in that context, I mean, yesterday we did a bit of a discussion on the SMEs, should they be treated separately and so on. Why SMEs become particularly important when I talk about this expanded view of green, right? And just to talk about the definition in India that we use for SMEs, there is something, in fact, before SMEs in India, it's called micro. It's not just small and medium, but also micro. We're looking at annual turnovers of, let's say, about $600,000, not PPP, just a direct Forex conversion. For small, we are looking at an annual turnover of about 6 million. And for medium, we're looking at an annual turnover of about 30 million. That's the kind of sizes of the enterprises we're talking about. Now, MSME sector in India contributes almost a quarter of, or rather a little more than a quarter, a third of our GVA, gross value added, 37% of the manufacturing, and almost 44% of the exports. So that's how significant the sector is. And employs almost 124 million people, which is a quarter of the total working age population. And it's the second largest employer after agriculture. Now we know that SMEs create many more jobs, and hence there is a need to focus on them from an Indian context. We also know that a lot of these green value chains that we are talking about, especially going beyond energy, are decentralized in nature. You are relying on biological resources. You can think of seaweed-based production, algae-based production. You're not going to centralize this at one area. So you need to actually look at what could be those decentralized models that can work for the industrialization. And then by the very nature of innovation, a lot of this innovation is coming from the young, new enterprises rather than the large, big incumbents. Of course, beyond a point when things become mainstream, sometimes the incumbent will acquire the young. But a lot of this is right now emerging from the young enterprises. And they do need specific support, which I'm going to talk about now. Typically in the innovation parlance, we talk about two values of death, right? Technological value of death and the commercial value of death. Now, a lot of these innovations in India are getting stuck at what we call the commercial value of death. So they have a technically viable solution deployed with some users, but not able to achieve the commercial scale. And this kind of becomes a little bit of a chicken and egg problem where they need capital support and other ancillary support to actually deploy these at large numbers so that they can generate evidence that, yes, these work, this is commercially viable, etc., so that they can actually then have the confidence of policymakers, investors, financiers to support them in order to unlock capital. Now, without the capital, you're not able to actually generate this confidence. And without actually creating this confidence, you're not able to get the capital in the first place. So stuck in this commercial value of death. And this is where we came and solved some of this for a few sectors in India and how we're trying to replicate. I'll talk about it. So one way to solve this is the classic VC approach, that if you're stuck at the commercial value of death, get venture capital and scale up. But when it comes to a lot of these green sectors, they're highly risky. The returns are not yet proven. So even VCs, or so-called impact investors, also are sitting on the fence. So the other way then to go is towards philanthropic capital or public capital, which can then be routed through enterprise accelerators and others and can be deployed into these young enterprises. But typically, the mandate of an enterprise accelerator is just to accelerate the enterprise and not necessarily look at the sector as a whole, which should be the mandate of industrial policy or the government, especially when you're looking at jobs as a big area, big dividend to be reaped upon. And typically, these accelerators will go wide because they want to sort of hedge risk, then deep in one particular sector. Now, the example that I'm going to talk about, which Ricardo mentioned, is of this distributed renewable energy for micro enterprises. So think of solutions like a cold storage running on solar or waste biomass, or a small DC refrigerator being used for a small fishery outlet, or a silk railing machine being used by tribal women, and so on and so forth. And similarly, and some of these are actually MIT startups like KTworks. So a micro solar pump being used by farmers with very small land holdings to meet their irrigation needs and so on. Now, a lot of these solutions were also stuck at that commercial value of death, where we came in and we first looked at what is the market opportunity and what is the jobs opportunity. And not to our surprise, because given the size of India, the market opportunity was $50 billion just for these distributed solutions, which could impact 37 million livelihoods. But only 0.5% of that had been realized. So what we started with was a kind of a unique combination of what we call an enterprise accelerator and an ecosystem accelerator. So you do what a typical traditional enterprise accelerator will do, provide the capital support, technical assistance, market linkages. But it kind of, on back of those enterprise success, generate evidence, do market research, do partnership with the ecosystem stakeholders, financiers, investors, and policymakers via evidence to actually then unlock support, not just for the enterprises working with you directly, but for the sector as a whole, move the needle for the sector forward. And some of the things that we managed to do in the last 3 odd years, directly deployed about 20,000 of these solutions, impacting 20,000 livelihoods, unlocked about $8 million debt or equity capital, and this is the most interesting thing, got the first dedicated policy going by Government of India to mainstream these solutions. And how did we do that? Just a little bit of behind the scenes, is to engage with financiers and investors who are otherwise sitting on the fence. They do not want to directly put money, but they were willing to learn about the sector through these quarterly convenings. So we got India's Green Bank, we got the private sector, VCs, etc., coming in, and just socialize the idea over the course of quarterly meetings. And slowly these meetings became pitch sessions, where now the enterprises were coming and actually pitching. And that's how we unlocked that capital that I was just talking about. We elevated the profile of these solutions in the sector to the highest levels of geopolitics. G20 last year happened in India. We leveraged the opportunity to showcase these to several ministers, several cabinet ministers, several energy ministers across the G20. So we did exhibitions right at where the G20 energy ministerial was happening and so on. And we generated a lot of knowledge and evidence, primary data gathering, market research, and so on. And all of this publicly available to shape the imaginations of those who can actually put in support into this, be it policymakers, be it investors, be it financiers. We started partnering with government. Governments always hesitate to partner with individual private entities, but when it comes to a non-partisan, not-for-profit, trying to represent the entire space, it becomes a lot more easy for them to partner. And we also end up, and just by the virtue of having many more solutions in our portfolio, it became far more interesting for the partners to partner with us than to have multiple partnerships with each individual enterprise. But we are, of course, also designing it in a way that we can be out of the system fairly soon. It should not be dependent on us just because we catalyzed the entire movement. Now, what next? So this was just one story or one case study of how we sort of use this enterprise acceleration and ecosystem acceleration model to design dedicated policy and market support for an emerging green sector. But a lot of this needs to happen for all these new areas, be it bamboo, seaweed, new materials, bio-based pharmaceuticals, not chemical-based pharmaceuticals, and so on. And a little bit of a playbook that we have created is start with showcasing the potential, because that interests both the private entities as well as the public entities. Jobs will be interesting for the politicians and policymakers. Investment opportunity would be interesting for the private sector, and so on. Showcase and sort of identify these early winners or early sort of success stories, so you can build on that and talk about the promise that this space and the sector has. And then create partnerships with financiers, with other ecosystem players, and so on, so that you can create a sense of an ecosystem rather than a few lone soldiers who are trying to move forward on this. And then socialize this in different quarters. Socialize this with governments, with political class, as well as the bureaucratic class, and so on and so forth. And we are right now doing this in East Indian state called Odisha, where we have met like 25 different departments of the state to talk about not just one sector, but 30 different emerging green sectors. And how can we sort of start mainstreaming them, what we heard earlier, as a whole of a state approach, rather than just an isolated approach for renewable energy or isolated approach for electric vehicles, but you bring them all together and start institutionalizing it right at the highest bureaucracy levels. Yeah, so that's a little bit what I wanted to share, not a post-ante assessment of what the industrial policy is doing, but or rather post-ex, but try and look at how we can design and shape not just industrial policy, but also momentum around some of these as we go forward, especially for the green sectors where you need to create many jobs in a developing country context.
Thank you. That was a very interesting discussion. I mean, maybe start with a question to the group, and then I'll open it up. Elizabeth said that the East Asian approach is very different. It's focused on trying to develop these new emerging green industries. And Alessio said that industrial policy in the West is not going to be enough. We need environmental policies to push. To what extent are these actually complements, right? And that the East Asian countries may be piggybacking or being crowded in by the anticipation or the perception that gray products are going to face headwinds in the future, and as a consequence, national policies can exploit those changes. And Abhishek was creating these green products. Small companies, I mean, India is not a country, it's a collection of many, many countries, right? So when you think of exports in India, we should think of exports out of your district. But is this driven by the fact that there's just innovation that is market superior, or is there a green premium need to sustain these industries? Is this sort of like accompanying the market, or is this sort of like against what market forces are going to be doing? And Chuck, what you essentially said, at the risk of ridiculously oversimplifying, is look, we know that we don't know, and everybody knows that they don't know. Even the people who write contracts, they know that they don't know, right? And so we need new forms of contracting. We need new forms of organizing things that incorporate the fact that we know that we don't know, that we need to learn in the process, and that the process of learning is part of the design. So what would you say in terms of how would you interpret these initiatives in terms of instantiating or not what you're saying, or what would you add to them in terms of like having them benefit from your paradigm? Why don't we start with Elizabeth? Are East Asian countries in some sense piggybacking on global environmental policies? And it's not just national stuff.
Yeah, that's, am I on? Yes. That's an excellent question. And I think, definitely you can't explain why South Korea and China have embraced green growth without an understanding of that broader international context and how it's played in. It's been absolutely crucial. And I think it started, with a kind of change in mindset. If I can explain, we use the term developmental environmentalism to refer to three things. And first and foremost, it's a way of thinking. It's a kind of logic, and it's grounded in the traditional developmental logic that holds that, the economy has a very particular purpose. set of ideas about the purpose of economic activity, which is to build and strengthen the nation. And then about the kind of growth that is going to deliver that strength, which is manufacturing capacity, technological autonomy, and export competitiveness. You can't have national strength and economic strength unless you have those three things. And then the third set of ideas is around, well, what's the appropriate goal for the state in achieving those goals? Well, it has to be strategic intervention because these goals are really about national survival. And in around 2008, the Korean, if I can speak to the Korean elite, started to change its way of thinking, thanks in no small part to external changes. And one of these was, of course, the growing perception of energy insecurity, which was that you did see the West increasingly conscious of climate change. You did see growing discussions about pricing carbon. You were also seeing this incredible price fluctuation associated with fossil fuels. And this was seen as an existential challenge to Korea's economic security. So all of a sudden, having been the kind of source of economic dynamism and economic security, fossil fuels were perceived as a threat. And at the same time, domestically, they were causing huge political legitimacy challenges because of particulate pollution. So you saw this reimagining, thanks in no small part to those external global changes, that we still, have this same developmental mindset about the purpose of the economy and about the importance of manufacturing and technology and export competitiveness, and the same logic about the role of the state, but it was the kind of growth that was going to deliver domestic political legitimacy and external status and prestige in terms of embracing greening, absolutely, but also energy security and economic security.
Thank you very much. I see Chuck moving.
I thought you wanted me. No.
Yes.
Okay. The movement in was response to your instigation.
Yes.
So let me put this in two parts. First, directed to your question, can these the standard environmental concerns, call it a carbon tax or cap and trade, is that a complement or an antagonist to it? So I want to say first that it can be both, but second that there's a showdown coming. And then I want to come back to the question that increasingly, not least in response to what I've been hearing here, is dear to my heart, which is this question of state capacity and its relation. So first on the question. So there's plenty of evidence of their complementarity. So the Tesla, the California Air Resources Board is the master example of a regulator of this new type state who went out and very deliberately built exactly these kinds of embedded autonomy relations that we're all talking about, but they were not found. The key point here is these were not found. Danny said yesterday that state capacity is the primitive of the economists. You work it back, the problem back to the point where the answer is more state capacity, and then you reach in the jar and pull out the state capacity, often in the form of the idea, okay, there'll be this collaboration, it will be on the basis of embedded autonomy. How do you get that if you're in a society like ours, which has systematically destroyed these kinds of intermediate organizations? Go back and read any history of the exchange between the government in the 1920s or the 1930s with these thousands upon thousands of organizations that were contrasted with now. It's different. Can it be built? And the answer is that the Air Resources Board, through a process I'm not going to describe, but had this aspect of getting people around to discuss what level of uncertainty was actionable and how to produce that. It produced the kinds of groups that in the long run turn out to what we need for embedded autonomy. So that's an example of deep complementarity. The Air Resources Board was dealing with classic environmental problems. Here's an example of a tension and a coming showdown with the EU. So on the one hand, The EU is and will continue to be a leader in green steel with the Swedes and the Austrians and on and on, the Germans. So then the question, these are massive investments. They are very promising. There will be green steel. It will be more expensive. And now you need to protect yourself against dirty competition. One way to do it is simply by falling back on your reflexes. We know how to deal with it. It's an externality. Raise the price of carbon. Or we'll have a carbon border adjustment tax. The technicalities of that are infernal, are absolutely infernal, because in order to determine whether steel is not, you have to look at the actual steel production process. It's enormously complicated. And thank goodness, there are variant ways of achieving the same result, like using bamboo for, instead of concrete. There are lots, we want that.
Let me just say that you're speaking like an Italian with your hands, but you also are holding the microphone. So
okay, well, you've
my impact.
No. Facciamo in italiano. So we can do it all, but okay, I was on the good. Now I don't know if I'm on the bad or the ugly, to keep it Italian. So the problem is, if you were to try to imagine, in order to have the carbon border adjustment mechanism work, you need a world where everyone has an exchange rate and you have terms of exchange between the exchange rates. Good luck. Good luck. So either there'll be a protectionist solution and, Turkey will do what it'll do, or people will say that, okay, we're going to actually agree on a process, on an envelope of processes, an open envelope of green steel process. If you meet that standard, you can export into the EU. And if you can show us that your way of doing it is as good or better, then you're part of the club. Okay, you don't have to adopt our standard. So I expect that as a practical matter, these things will conflict, but also mutually fructify. And so I don't think that there is an incompatibility. I think there are antagonisms, but I think that that's the least of our problems right now. Having more people pushing for this kind of solution, even if they're sometimes pushing against each other, is better than less pressure. So that's the first thing. The second thing I just want to say very briefly on this question.
Sorry? Briefly, indeed.
Very briefly, and in English, on this question of state capacity. The only way to build state capacity, if you don't have a magic wand, is to build it while you're learning to do it. You have to create the capacity in attempting to solve the problem. And so these institutions that's what is fascinating about this current moment. In the successful cases, you're actually seeing the joint transformation of the policy and the institution. And that's something one might study if you had an interdisciplinary group of highly talented people, some of whom are in the very central organizations like the OECD or the World Bank, whose own staff members have to learn to do this stuff. So I would just modestly suggest that in a subsequent edition of this, there be some focus on that joint transformation.
I feel I'm pulled into the conversation not only by the Italian, but the reference to carbon border adjustment tax, which is something that the European Union has been looking at. The rationale for that, along the lines of what you're saying, is, look, we're raising carbon prices a lot in Europe, so we want to make sure that this doesn't create an incentive for firms to move out. So we roll in a carbon tax at the border. We do it for selected products, by the way, steel being one of them. The selected products list has been based on what was simple. So imagine steel is considered simple, cement is considered simple with respect to things like a car or a chair. Imagine figuring out the carbon content of more complex products. It is our let's say the discourse in Europe has been very much along the lines of what your question was, that this type of tool will sort of have spillover effects in other parts of the world. And so that it will push other countries to green their production in the interest of being able to serve the European market. I personally believe that this is a bit of a hubristic statement, in the fact that, even in our calculations, we look at how much this will matter, for which countries this will matter. For given the costs of decarbonizing your economy and how much you must be trading with the European Union, it will really matter for very selected countries, and the ones that trade a lot with Europe, the ones that are very close to Europe. And so to imagine that this is pushing Southeast Asia to change their economies, I think is a bit too much. It might be doing something for Turkey, for example. It is a country where we're seeing more climate action, supposedly as a result of carbon border adjustment in Europe, but not, I suspect, with respect to Vietnam or China or other nations that are interested in what you're describing, and so in being leaders in the technologies of the future, to my mind.
Abhishek.
Yeah, in fact, if I may just quickly add on CBAM as well, and I think this should work. Yeah. So interestingly, the India story on how it is reacting to this carbon border adjustment mechanism is that publicly there's a pushback, but privately companies are actually trying to see what can they do, because ultimately it's going to hit a few companies a lot more because they are exposed to exports in the Europe a lot more. They are trying to already figure out, can we do green steel, can we expedite investments and so on. While publicly, of course, the government position is to sort of push back by the WTO and so on. On the question of green premium, I think, of course, the answer varies based on the product types, services that we are looking at. There are few which are right from the get-go can be far more lucrative. An example which comes to my mind is, let's say, solar dryers to dry your perishables into dried products, like a chamomile tea or a rose tea and so on. Far more cost-effective than a typical electricity-based dryer. Right? But majority of the cases, you would see that the green products are costly. Now, whether you want to put a green premium or whether you want to put a grey tax, that is up to the policymakers and the market. Like, do you only want to position this as, okay, you need to pay more because this is green, or you want to say that you actually have to pay more because that is great. So in one way or the other, you need to create a little bit of a level playing field. The other thing is that because many of these are at very early stages, the learning curve is still ahead of them. You do need to provide them support at that stage so that once they have achieving economies of scale, they might be able to compete even without a grey tax, let's say.
Well, I'm told by the powers that be that we have to bring this session to a close. You are not getting a break. You are getting a boon that you're going to listen to Daron Acemoglu now directly into the next session. So let me stop here. Thank the panel for a great discussion.